Well, thank you all for coming this evening, and very warm thanks to Ross for organising this event and allowing me to publicise my research, which was largely carried out in the Oxley Library, just across the bridge. But I had been here once, many moons ago, to look at some of the files relating to the origins of the Anzac Day Commemoration Committee, and in particular the recruiting committee files, which are here. And Canon Garland was also a leading member of the recruiting committee, for reasons which I explain more in my book, which is over there. If people feel so inclined to purchase a cheap copy, it's only $30. If you were buying it directly from the publishers in Canberra, it would be a lot more, like $55 because of the freight. Anyway, well, I have a distinct advantage when it comes to writing about a figure like Canon Garland, because I am not a politically correct priest. This enables me, as an octogenarian, to penetrate the mind of the architect of Anzac Day, whose picture you see there as a young man, as a deacon in his very unhirsute days, before he sported a beard. Historians, of course, you have to bear in mind, need to grow old in order to have an accumulated storehouse of memory or database, which enables them to take a long-term perspective on things. Now, let me be more precise. My age gives me an insight into the world of ideas of people who lived and worked back in the 30s. As well, the historian must practice the discipline of Nacherleben. That's a German word, technical word that means literally to re-experience the past in order to understand it in the terms of the people who lived back then. And so-called political correctness does not help us here, because those who embrace political correctness judge the past with the values of the present, and that frustrates any attempt to get anything approaching an accurate insight into what our ancestors really thought was important. And that will inevitably be different from what many people think is important today. Now, like most people born in the long shadow of the First World War, I am an unashamed empire patriot, as David Garland was. The intensity of our loyalty has to be experienced to be understood. We owed our existence to the empire. My father's Syrian Christian parents fled in 1888 from the Turkish Empire to this part of the British Empire in order to have political, religious and economic freedom. They had been Syrian Orthodox Christians, and they gladly became subjects of Queen Victoria. My mother's family came from Glasgow, Scotland, if you didn't know, and they came out in 1920 as part of the then operating Empire settlement scheme. And it was like for them simply moving from a cold, damp and depressed part of the empire to a much warmer, but not necessarily drier part namely the Atherton tableland. It can be very wet up there. But it was the same political culture. And this is precisely what the Dublin-born David John Garland did in 1886, when at the age of 19 he boarded the SS Jumna in London and sailed for Brisbane. Little is known about David Garland's life in Dublin, except that his father had been for a long time, a non-academic worker at Trinity College, where he and his wife had 4 children, of whom the two boys, David and Richard, made their careers in Australia. Richard, 1870 to 1919, became a man of significant wealth, having become managing director of the Dunlop Rubber Company in Melbourne. David, by contrast, became initially a humble law clerk in Toowoomba, though his name is nowhere in the records of the Queensland Law Society, and I did some considerable checking up on why that is the case. That he did work for a law firm appears to be incontestable, but he would have been a managing clerk who doesn't have to be registered by the Law Society. I checked in Pew's Almanac that gives information on businesses, among other things, and it only records the fact that one, D.J. Garland, was a member of the Toowoomba branch of the Masonic Lodge. The record is clear, however, that the young Garland must have worked in a law firm, possibly, as I said, as a managing clerk, because he is in later life referred to as a priest with a considerable legal experience. At any rate, he arrives in Toowoomba as a young man and begins work there for a law firm, we assume. What we do know for certain is that he abandoned the law very early, having come under the influence of the Reverend Tommy Jones here, who was a priest of extraordinary entrepreneurial ability, something that Garland obviously inherited, and a very convinced, tight churchman, in short, a disciple of the Oxford movement, which changed the face of the Church of England, as one American wit phrased it, from being the Tory party at prayer to being the working class at Mass. He did so in order to characterise the radical new direction which the Church took after 1845. Now, that is not to say that the Church suddenly became overnight aware of its Catholic heritage, and that there were suddenly priests celebrating the Eucharist in coloured vestments with candles on the altar, and the use of incense to symbolising prayer ascending. That did not happen for a while. Indeed, the initial phase of the movement was entirely intellectual, spiritual, and the so-called externals, which when they were introduced, caused a certain amount of controversy from people who could not get their head around the proposition that being a Catholic did not mean being subject to the Bishop of Rome. Rather, it meant being in the apostolic succession, preserving the threefold ministry of bishops, priests and deacons, and rigorously celebrating the sacraments for the benefit of the faithful in accordance with the rites as laid down in the Book of Common Prayer. When Garland came under the influence of Tommy Jones in Toowoomba, he could not have been further away from the mind and practice of the Oxford movement. Why? Because he came from an Orange family in Ireland. Now, what does that mean? We don't hear much these days about the Orange Lodge in Australia. So what did it stand for? in a word, something very, very Protestant, very divisive and quite often extremely violent. But based as it was on upholding the Protestant faith, it did inculcate an extensive and deep knowledge of the Bible in many of its adherents. And for David Garland's biography, this is very significant, as we shall see. But the Orange movement in Ireland is still alive and well, and is, as this comment I will quote from a leading Irish scholar confirms, and I quote, "The Orange Order was born out of violence and has frequently been the occasion of war, but must be seen as in an intensely violent context. What has been constant about the Irish people through recorded history is their capacity for very reckless violence, allied to a distorted moral sense, which magnifies small sins, yet regards murder as trivial. Their kindness and hospitality are legendary, but so too is their reputation for hypocrisy and cruelty. The frightfulness of the crimes committed in modern Ireland is to be explained by patterns of behaviour which are of great antiquity." End of quote. Now, when the young Garland came to Australia, he had to put all that behind him. Most of the Orange tradition, such as the March of the Apprentices, traditionally held to celebrate the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 every year on the 12th of July, it was continued, and of course he was very much aware of that. He could not forget that event. It has been the occasion of horrendous sectarian violence perpetrated by both Roman Catholic and Protestant sides throughout the centuries, in fact. And so the Orange March every year serves to perpetuate deep and painful divisions in the country, both north and south. And one only needs to wander through the Falls Road district of Belfast to appreciate this, because there the houses of both sides are decorated with depictions of past atrocities. In addition, the Republic flag is defiantly flown there on Roman Catholic houses, while the Union Jack is seen to be waving triumphantly on others in the neighbouring streets. I have a story to tell about walking through there, but I'll skip that. Obviously, Garland was acutely aware of this situation, but the encounter with Tommy Jones must have made a life-changing impact, because the wise old English priest was able to convert the young Dubliner into being an ardent Anglo-Catholic. And that represents an enormous spiritual, intellectual turnaround. Now, this is of crucial significance to the entire story of Anzac. Of course, you would need to be equipped with both priestly and historical training to see it. But Canon Jones, the crusading Anglo-Catholic in Toowoomba and later on in Brisbane, made out of this prickly Orange Protestant, David Garland, a loyal disciple. Now, why is that so central? Well, simply because Canon Garland was able to channel the passion, energy and intelligence of his Canon Jones was able, I think I said Garland, his energy into an entirely new direction. And once understood, was embraced with a zeal tempered by a love of learning. We know this because Canon Garland wrote with great conviction about the importance of the Oxford movement, and at the same time about the underlying crucial cultural significance of biblical knowledge, not only for personal piety, but for the fuller appreciation of the mission of the British Empire to the peoples of the world. In the 19th century, when the British Empire had become the greatest power in the world, it produced such leaders as Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone, because he was a devoted member of the church and had been in office for such a long time and had developed a particular sense of mission for the empire based on the idea that Almighty God had bestowed such power on the British peoples for a distinct purpose, and that was to use its influence to spread Christianity throughout the world. Why? Because this was the religion that liberated peoples for service to their fellow human beings. In Gladstone's mind, Britain's empire should stand for liberty, justice and peace, and all the peoples who lived under the Union Jack upon which the sun never set should be given their freedom. Of course, that was an ideal that was very hard to live up to and implement in practice. But it is one which the Church of England embraced wholeheartedly, and all its bishops, to a man, whether they were in Calcutta or Calgary, Brisbane or Bermuda, Cape Town or Christchurch, preached the liberating message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, this indeed was the basis of Canon Garland's concept of empire. It was to be an instrument of God to convert the world to Christ, and the best way of doing this was to impart the virtues of British political culture to all the peoples under its sway, and to defend it vigorously if it was ever threatened by dangerous forces outside it. Now, Garland had read theology under the guidance of Tommy Jones in Toowoomba, in accordance with the practice in those days when there were no theological colleges. A young man who perceived a vocation to holy orders attached himself to a learned clergyman who guided his reading until he felt sufficiently knowledgeable to take the bishop's examination. And if successful, the candidate would be ordained, first deacon, of course, and that is what happened to Garland. He was made deacon by the Bishop of Grafton in 1889, and after service in the bush, ordained priest in Perth in 1892. And there he served with considerable distinction for an entire decade. And Western Australia at that point in our nation's history was a very interesting place for a man of Garland's formation to be. Why? First, it was a diocese rapidly expanding, and not only in town, but particularly in the bush, where it was challenged with the crucial ministry to Aborigines. But as well in Fremantle, which was the take-off point for troop ships to the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902, another ministerial challenge developed for the young Garland, namely that of army chaplaincy. And there you can see him as the only man standing in that group of soldiers with a dog collar. At that time, Garland became an army chaplain to troops in training before embarkation. All the Australian colonies supplied volunteers to the Empire's cause in South Africa. It was a war of little understood in its significance. The bottom line was that Britain could not afford to lose the struggle, because other powers, particularly Germany, would have seen it as proof of the Empire's weakness and taken a very aggressive stand against it. All the dominions volunteered precisely because they could not stand aside and see Britain defeated or humiliated at the hands of the Boers. This would have sent a signal to the Germans in particular. The Kaiser was very interested in this, and surprisingly also the Americans, that if Britain failed to defend its South African colonies, then by definition it could not defend the others. They would be open for a change of imperial masters. The significance of this at the time cannot be overstressed. So the volunteers who fought in the Boer War were really defending Australia's British institutions of parliamentary democracy and liberty. Garland endorsed this wholeheartedly. Soldiers were essential for the protection of our institutions. So Garland was not a starry-eyed pacifist by any means. He was a muscular Christian who saw the necessity of being strong in order to deter the designs of rival powers. Before leaving Western Australia, where Garland exercised a remarkably energetic ministry, it needs to be stressed that his major achievements there was his campaign to get the Education Act changed to allow Bible instruction into government schools. Why was this important? Well, as we have learned, Garland was an admirer of Mr. Gladstone. The British Empire's essential justification was its ability to influence the political culture of the peoples over which it held sway. And that culture, he insisted, had its roots in the Bible. So Garland's vision was that all the children in the Empire should have basic biblical knowledge, because it was from Holy Scripture that we derived our values, such as the rule of law, of decency and justice. Now, Garland became known as a nation. He became known nationwide for his promotion of Bible classes in government schools, and for ministers of religion to have access, the right of access to schools for 1 hour a week to teach religion to their flock. So when he transferred to Queensland, there he is as rector of Holy Trinity Woolloongabba. He was nominated by all the associated churches to conduct a campaign for the Bible in state schools in this state. The Roman Church, of course, opposed this strongly on the basis that it could mean that their children could be exposed to heretical teaching by Protestants. Nevertheless, the campaign that Garland conducted led to a referendum that overwhelmingly endorsed the amendment to the Education Act, and that happened in 1911. It meant that the majority of Queenslanders at that time supported the proposition that Garland was advancing, namely that to become good citizens, children needed to know from where our values came. So the Bible in State Schools League that Garland led on behalf of the member churches issued a reader, which I remember from my school days, consisting of extracts from both the Old and New Testaments, which underlined the civic virtues of love of neighbour, service to others, honest dealing, diligence at work, support of the sick and aged, and peace and harmony in society and the world. In short, all the civic virtues. That is the committee that he was secretary of, and you see him as a young man ringed in that photograph. Now, I remember our classes in this regard very well during the 30s and 40s, and our Anglican priest coming into the school with his Methodist and Presbyterian friends to hold their classes at the same time. We all hived off into our different denominational categories. Now, here is a major factor in our overall story of Garland's significance for the Anzac commemoration on both sides of the Tasman. In 1912, the New Zealand Bible in Schools League invited Garland over there to lead their campaign for the same thing. His fame had spread across there. And so he was, being the inveterate traveller he was, off he went with his wife and young son to Wellington. From his base there, he toured the length and breadth of both islands with his message, much to the irritation of the Roman Catholic section and the atheist, which is rather ironic. It was a busy time for him, and also very controversial. So our canon became a very controversial figure. Being the man he was, he made himself known to the influential people in the land, the church leaders, the mayors, the politicians and public servants, most of whom were very strong supporters of the cause. Now, Garland had the knack of being able to speak to the highest in the land down to the man in the street, a fact which later gave him a high degree of clout when it came to explaining to them how Anzac Day should be celebrated. He had done so well in his campaign in New Zealand that the New Zealand bishops wanted to nominate him for a Lambeth doctorate. But his Brisbane Archbishop, there he is with the stern face, Sinclair Donaldson, would not support it. He had to recommend the promotion to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he refused to do it. But he made the curious comment that Garland had no learning, but he was extraordinarily well informed. So the Garlands returned to Brisbane, the war having broken out, and immediately now the 51-year-old Garland throws himself into recruitment work. He reactivated his chaplain's commission, and after the collapse of the Gallipoli campaign at the end of 1915 and the return of hundreds of wounded back to Australia, particularly in Brisbane, the Brisbane Recruiting Committee, organised by Garland, convenes a meeting at the exhibition hall, presided over by the Governor, Gould Adams, and attended by the Premier, leading politicians and mayors, plus the leading personalities of the mainstream churches, including the Roman Catholic Archbishop James Dewig, another Irishman with whom Garland got on very well. Now, the outcome of that historic meeting held on the 10th of January 1916 was a resolution to set up a committee to decide how to commemorate the Gallipoli landing. Now, the meeting then made a historic decision, namely to elect Canon Garland to be the organising secretary. He went to work with his customary great energy and invited the heads of all the mainstream churches, including the synagogue, to nominate a representative on what was to become the Anzac Day Commemoration Committee. Now, leading members of the Brisbane Recruiting Committee were co-opted, including the man responsible for naming the 25th of April as the day of remembrance. And that was Thomas Augustine Ryan. He's in this picture too. He was in the previous one. Who was a local, high-profile businessman, an auctioneer, in fact, in Brisbane, who had a son, had served at Gallipoli and survived. Further, the Premier of Queensland was nominated chairman, plus Brisbane's two Lord Mayors. We had two Lord Mayors in those days. There was one in Brisbane and one in South Brisbane, as well as army representatives. But as Garland always stressed, it was a civilians committee, and key personages on it were the Anglican and Roman Catholic archbishops or their representative, and all the other mainstream churches as well, and they were largely former army chaplains. Their names could be nominated, but I'll leave that out. Their first task was to determine how Anzac Day should be celebrated. In Garland's mind, soldiers were warriors of Christ, crusaders for justice and peace against the forces of injustice and tyranny. Now, whether they were aware of it or not, they had laid down their lives for their friends, as it says in St John's Gospel, chapter 15, verse 13. So in commemorating the fallen, the people at home were remembering with sorrow and gratitude thousands of selfless acts of supreme sacrifice. There had to be a solemn act of remembrance. Now in France, the fallen in the nation's many wars since the distant past were collectively remembered on All Souls' Day. That's the 2nd of November in the church's calendar. As Garland appreciated, this would not have been possible for Australia to follow. The population was split into too many denominations, most of which would object to the idea of praying for the dead, while Roman Catholics, in any case, were forbidden to pray with so-called non-Catholics. Consequently, a totally new day and a new kind of commemoration needed to be thought out. And there you see the notice of Anzac Day and the badge that the committee designed, which is only available in Queensland. It's a uniquely Queensland thing. Oh, you bought me. Thank you very much. This is a $2 one. There you go. Initially, they were 1 shilling, and we were asked to bring a shilling to school on the day before to get one. But not all children managed to do that. I recall a shilling in those days was quite a lot of money. Now, I'm convinced that only a man of Garland's calibre or background, as a member of the Church of Ireland and a former Orangeman, could have devised a form of service in which all denominations, as well as Jews and atheists, could participate. This was the basic idea. This was a challenging task because Garland had to get citizens of divergent and even hostile religious beliefs collectively to unite in an act of reverence and penitence, the penitence for the sin of war. But he achieved this by insisting that there should be hymns sung of purely theistic content. The Holy and Undivided Trinity would not be mentioned, and there was no praying out loud for the dead, as this was theologically unacceptable to many. So what did he come up with? The 2-minute silence. Garland was the originator of this practice for the entire British Empire, regardless of what some misinformed journalists have claimed in their ignorance. Can we have the next slide? So Garland devises the liturgy for Anzac Day. The next slide. Yeah, there it is. You can see an example of the march, but then if you look down at the lower right-hand side, you'll see what it contains. It took place after monuments had been built, of course, led by civic dignitaries and a former army chaplain who spoke about greater love hath no man than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. How often have I heard that? The service was effectively a secular requiem, and it was preceded by a march of returned men accompanied by serving soldiers, as well as return, of course, scouts and guides, cubs and brownies. I've marched in many of an Anzac Day march with original diggers as a little boy. But originally, prior to that, again, there would have been services in all the churches marking the day. And in Anglican and Roman Catholic churches, it was also celebrated as St Mark's Day. Hence, you see the line of St Mark on the silk ribbon worn on Anzac Day, but only in Queensland. After the march and the cenotaph service, there would be luncheons held in the Shire Hall, consisting of sandwiches and tea put on by the ladies' guilds of all the churches and the RSL Ladies' Auxiliary. Now, this was intended to fortify those old diggers who had come in from the farms out in the country, often some distance out of town, wherever there was a rail service, they got free passes for the day. And this was all organised every year by Canon Garland. He wished both to honour the diggers and to provide creature comforts for them. And this had to be organised, as I said, every year by him and his committee. It wrote to all the municipalities in the state to give them guidelines for the observance, but in addition to that, Garland wrote to the mayors of all the major cities in Australia and New Zealand with the same, recommending the same guidelines until each state had passed its own Anzac Day legislation. Finally, the Commonwealth in 1930 passed its legislation so that by then Anzac Day was an established part of the nation's calendar. It did not happen overnight. It all originated in the mind of one far-sighted patriotic priest who saw the need and knew how to implement it. Now the big question is, why did Garland, at the age of 53, insist on going to Egypt and Palestine in 1917? He wanted to go earlier than that, but he had to get a special commission from the Minister for the Army, Senator Pearce, in order to make the trip as a special chaplain. He had been in close touch with a fellow priest and friend, namely William Maitland Woods, formerly rector of St Mary's, Kangaroo Point, and now a chaplain in Egypt. He was there from the beginning and later at Gallipoli. Maitland Woods kept up a regular correspondence, most of which is preserved in the Oxley Library. Fascinating reading. With Garland, and Garland sent him regularly copies of the Church Chronicle to keep him informed about what's going on in the diocese. Two things worried Garland about what was happening in Egypt. First, how the fallen soldiers were being buried and why some 300 Anzacs were dishonourably discharged and sent home in disgrace because they had contracted VD. He became very determined to do something about it. So he petitioned the Minister of the Army, as I said, Senator Pearce, to send him to Egypt to check the war grave situation and the question of troop morality. And this is key to understanding the man. He knew very well that the troops on leave in foreign cities would visit brothels and sleazy pubs. And of course, enlisted men had no alternatives, no clubs for them, except initially, of course, the YMCA and the Salvation Army, but they were not enough. The Anzacs in Cairo were right in the flesh pots of Egypt. And did you know that as soon as the British Army moved into Egypt to drive back the Turks, the prostitutes' population of Cairo multiplied exponentially. They streamed in from London and Paris via Marseille, knowing that business would be brisk. And did you know that the Australian bishops as chaplains general, all the diocesan bishops, Roman and Anglican, and I assume also heads of other churches, were being fully informed by the government? So Garland's request to investigate the situation was granted, and he left for Egypt on a troop ship in September 1917 with a handsome sum of money that he had collected via the Lavender Fund of £4,000, which in today's money would be approximately 50 times that value. He used the money to open hostels for Anzacs in Cairo and in Egypt and Syria. And there you see one of them in, I forget which town that's in. I can find out though. I suspect it's Damascus, but it could be Cairo. The point is that he set up places for diggers to come and spend time and relax, and where they'd have a bed for the night and meals, be able to write letters home. That was extremely important to him, that the diggers had the opportunity to go write letters home. This was extremely important so that they would not forget where they came from and their loved ones, especially their mothers and sweethearts and wives at home. He reported also to the authorities on the moral conditions of the men, but his view was, this was the point, that you cannot complain about troop behaviour when on leave unless you have provided somewhere wholesome for them to go and things to do. And one of the things he loved doing was taking the troops out to see the pyramids, because only an officer could go to the pyramids. I mean, men could only go accompanied by an officer. And he, as a lieutenant colonel, did that, and he always took nurses with him. Having nurses there was a what would you call it, an ameliorating influence, keeping them gentlemen. So he took them out to see the pyramids, as I say, with nurses to accompany them. But more than that, he actually, at the age of 53, accompanied troops into action as a RAP chaplain, where he helped with the wounded, with General Chauvel's endorsement. And for his service, he was actually awarded a medal for that event. And while he was particularly in Jerusalem, the undoubted highlight of his Middle East experience was following General Allenby's triumphant entry into the Holy City, where Garland hastened to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was, of course, under Greek Orthodox administration. And he was permitted to celebrate the Holy Eucharist at an altar reserved for the Church of England priests. And for this act of piety, Garland used the sacred vessels that had been given to him as a parting present from his friends here in Brisbane. This began what can only be called an unusually warm and deeply spiritual relationship with the Orthodox. All through the time he was in Palestine. Canon Garland loved the Orthodox, including the Russians, and was hopeful that one day the Church of England and the Orthodox churches would unite to realise Jesus' high priestly prayer in John 17:21, that they all may be one. At any rate, while he was in Palestine and Syria, Garland worked so hard for the welfare of the Eastern Orthodox Christians who had been for centuries oppressed by the Muslim Turks that he was awarded by the Patriarch the Cross of Jerusalem. And there you see it there, which is now held in a church in Chichester Diocese in England, where he gave it to his sister, since deceased, of course. Well, Canon Garland stayed on in the Middle East until early 1919, working arduously for troop welfare, right to the end, as well as trying to improve relations with the Coptic Christians in Egypt on behalf of the British authorities. There's a lot more that can be said, but it's all in my book, which is over there. Back in Brisbane. Once home, the indefatigable Canon had a series of major tasks to complete. First, he had to resume control of the Soldiers' Church of England Help Society with its extensive welfare work among the returned men, especially the sick and dying in the various hospitals around Brisbane. He had, together with Captain E.R.B. Pike, to resume the work of the committee, the Anzac Day Commemoration Committee. And he became the driving force behind the Lord Mayor's committee to build the great Anzac Memorial, which you see pictured there in Ann Street, which links up with the not Adelaide. What's the next street after Ann? Adelaide is Adelaide, and the story of that, how that all came to pass, is also related in detail in my book. At the same time, he was energetically working to resettle young people from the United Kingdom in a settlement scheme to find jobs in Queensland. But there was more. All through his priesthood from the early days in Western Australia, Canon Garland fostered mission work among the first Australians. In this he was far ahead of his time because he wanted them complete emancipation, that is, citizenship and the right to serve in the army. He thought that was important. And that is not all. In 1920, Canon Garland became rector of St Barnabas Church in Ithaca, here in Brisbane. The church he served faithfully until he died in the 9th of October 1939, having collapsed after celebrating the Eucharist that Sunday. Canon Garland was above all a faithful pastor electing to be buried from the church he had served faithfully for 20 years. Now, if you look closely at that slide of him being carried in the coffin from the church, you will see nearly all those men are members of the Queensland Cabinet. You can see Forgan Smith on the extreme right, and on the left, if you look closely, you will see Ned Hanlon. And he was a very close friend of both those men, both Labor Party. And Ned Hanlon, of course, was a Roman Catholic, but he loved Garland and did not hesitate to come to the church and be his pallbearer. But he was not just, as I say, a pastor of the parish of Ithaca, where his memory is still warmly cultivated. He was, by virtue of his variegated enterprises, pastor to the entire nation. Indeed, he was an exceptional priest, one of whom Archbishop Donaldson had described as a Triton among the minnows. And you see in that photograph, if you look carefully at the list of achievements throughout his life, you will see that he really was a pastor to the nation. And it was described by Donaldson as a Triton among the minnows, which is not an inconsiderable image to have. And we will not see his like again, I venture to suggest. Thank you for listening.